Hey everybody, Pastor Christian here. Trying to get through these questions that you guys have asked. So let's go ahead and dive right in. We'll see if we can get 4 more answered today. All right. So question number 1. It doesn't sound like the Bible directly speaks to gender as different than sex. Do we assume they're the same in Scripture? And this is a new cultural debate. So the short answer is yes and yes. So does the Bible directly speak to gender as different than sex? I would say no, not directly, and that's true. Historically, mankind has always equated gender and sex. It is a relatively new social construction to delineate between the two. At least that's as I understand it. Doesn't mean that there haven't always been transgender people. I think we can look at history and find examples of that, sure. But historically, we have always referred to gender and sex as interchangeably. It's only now in our current cultural vernacular that we are delineating between the two. So this is, I talked about this in the last video. So what we have to understand is scripturally, the Bible does not differentiate between gender and sex. So we need to understand when we read the Bible and we see gender and sex, they are used interchangeably. So we're not supposed to read our cultural understanding into the text. We're supposed to read the text as it was written and then apply that to our cultural understanding. So I hope that answers that. So there's another question in the 4 that I'd like to, that's really similar to that. So I'm just going to jump to that next one. Does the modern application of gender and gender identity to people reflect a departure from a biblical worldview that we should be building back to? Yes. However, so when I say however, don't think I'm reneging on it. Absolutely, the biblical worldview, sure. The modern application of gender and gender identity, it doesn't have to actually necessarily reflect a departure from a biblical worldview. For example, if I say that my sex is male and my gender is also male, to say that my gender expression is male, I don't think is a departure from a worldview, from a biblical worldview. The departure from a biblical worldview is when we start believing that someone's biological sex does not inform their expression of gender. Instead, we need to recognize that the sexual binary that humanity retains, the sexual binary is an indication. It is part of, it is included in what it is to be created in the image of God. This is, again, goes back to Genesis 1, male and female, He created them. He created them male and female in the image of God. So the sexual binary is part of being created in the image of God. If our gender expression would seek to change that sexual binary, would seek to change the body that God has given us, that God has created in us, then I would say we're violating 1 Corinthians 6 and dishonoring God with our body. So does the modern application of gender and gender identity to people reflect a departure from the biblical worldview? It depends if you're differentiating between the two and you're giving license. If you're giving license to dishonor one's body, then yes, that would be a departure from a biblical worldview that we should be building back to. Okay, so wow, 2 questions in 4 minutes. That's pretty quick, at least for these other videos. All right, so now let's go to the 3rd one. How can we balance the fine line between being loving versus condoning something opposed to our faith, or between standing up for one's faith and being loving versus, or standing up for one's faith versus just being a jerk? Well, I think I don't think that there has to be a fine line between standing up for one's faith and just being a jerk. But in answer to this question, how can we balance the fine line between the two? And I understand why they're asking. Sometimes what we believe about our faith, people can take offense to that, and because people are offended by it, they might be defensive and they might lash back at our faith, calling our faith bigoted or closed-minded. Hateful is one that happens a lot. And so we can, in response to that, we can get defensive because we perceive an attack and we want to defend ourselves against attack. And so we can get defensive. And so it just escalates back and forth, back and forth. So the question that's asked, though, is how can we balance the fine line between being loving versus condoning something opposed to our faith? Again, I don't think that's a fine line. I don't think it's a fine line between being loving and condoning something opposed to our faith. I think what happens, and I understand why this person is using that phrase, it's a fine line, because if we don't give approval to someone's behavior, someone may perceive that lack of approval as disapproval of their identity and who they feel they are, and that can feel very unloving. So I understand why the term fine line is used. But I think what it comes down to answer the question, how can we balance that? I think when we see people who don't agree with us, the question you have to ask is, what do you see? Do you see an enemy? Do you see someone in opposition? Do you see someone from the other side? And all of those things are really important, because what we do when we identify, it's like, I'm a conservative. I don't think that's a big surprise to anyone. But if and I'm also I try to listen to both sides, and one of the things that I hear people talk about is conservatives. These conservatives, or these right wingers, or these MAGA Republicans. Conversely, conservatives talk about the leftists or the progressives or the woke mafia. And what we do is we use these terms and we use these labels. And what happens when we use these labels is it allows us to objectify people, to turn people into objects. And as we turn people into objects, it's much easier to be opposed to. I'm going to grab something like this as a highlighter I have on my desk right here. It's much easier for me to look at this highlighter and say bad things about this highlighter, because the highlighter can't feel anything because it's just an object. The same is true with people. If we objectify people, then it's real easy to come across as being a jerk, because we don't see the people that we're hurting, we see objects. And that is, I think, where we mess up. So how can we find that balance? Really simple. We need to see people as people. We need to see people that have the same struggles, that have the same heartaches, that have the same burdens, that have the same cares, that have the same worries as we do. Sure, they may manifest differently, but they feel the same as we do. We need to truly, it comes down to seeing people with the eyes of Christ. And if you look at Jesus, when he saw the crowds of people, John chapter 2 is a good example. You finish John chapter 2 going into John chapter 3, and one of the things that the transition verse there in John 2 is that Jesus understood what was in the hearts of people, and so he didn't trust himself to men, meaning that he knew people were going to let him down because he knew deeply in their hearts. Yet, the remainder of John 3 is Jesus ministering to a Pharisee that came to him in the middle of the night, and teaching him and demonstrating compassion and love. And then you go to John 4, and Jesus does the same thing for a Samaritan woman. And so what you see in the life of Jesus, and I think it's John, it actually may be John 6, I'll go find it right now. What we see in the heart of Jesus is that he saw people as people. He didn't see them as objects. And too often what we do is we may see the opposition as the opposition. We may see the other side as a side. We see them as leftist, progressive, woke mafia. We see them as MAGA Republicans and conservatives and right-wingers. We don't see them as people. And it's really important that we understand that people, every single person, is a creation of God. And in being a creation of God, they bear with them the inherent dignity of being created in the image of God. And that dignity, it's almost like a royalty. It demands compassion. It demands respect, because people bear the image of God. So it's really, really important. So it's Matthew 9. It says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. When Jesus saw the crowds, that word compassion, in the Greek it's splachnitiomai. And what it means is to have this, it means to feel it down into your bowels, into your core, into your gut. It's a gut feeling. And so when Jesus saw the people, it struck him to his core, and he had that's what that compassion was, that really just reached into his core, and he saw that they were harassed and helpless. They saw like sheep needing to be cared for, sheep that needed a shepherd. We need to see people as people and not objectify them as the opposition. And I think if we do that, then we can look at someone who may disagree with us or live a lifestyle that we are adamantly opposed to, and yet we can still afford to that person generous compassion, respect, and human dignity, because they're created in the image of God. So I think the first step in how we can balance that between loving versus condoning is see them as a person, see them as someone that Jesus died for, and try to reach them where they're at, rather than rather than winning the victory over them. Jesus has already won the victory. We don't need to defeat other people. Jesus always wins. So we need to see them as people. All right. Now we'll go to the fourth question, and this is a good one. And I mentioned this in my sermon. I actually went back and listened to it to hear what I said. That was a while ago that I went back and listened to it, so I don't remember the exact verbiage. You said that gender dysphoria is not a mental illness. Is the same true for anorexia, another form of body dysphoria? And you could also say, you didn't have to use anorexia. You could also use BID, body identity, body integrity identity, or body identity integrity disorder. And that's where people feel like they need they shouldn't have one of their arms, or they shouldn't have their sight, like they should be physically disabled in some way. And I know disabled is probably not the PC term to use, but so they will get surgeries where they'll do something to damage their eyesight so they no longer can see, or maybe people they have BID and they know that they should be paralyzed, and so they'll try to find doctors who will perform surgeries to paralyze them. So for example, and so that is classified as a disorder. And some people might say, well, what's the difference between gender dysphoria, when people will change their bodies to match their expression of gender because that's how they feel they should be? All right, so it's a fair question. So let me backtrack a little bit on this. You said that gender dysphoria is not a mental illness. Okay, so first thing, my name is Christian, and I'm a pastor. I have 3 college degrees. I have 17 to 18 years of professional ministry experience. And with all that experience and all that education, 2 master's degrees, 1 bachelor, what that means, it doesn't mean that I'm qualified to say what is and what is not a mental illness. So I actually pulled up the site, the American Psychiatric Association. American Psychiatric Association, who is, they are the people with the training and the experience and the authority to say that what is a clinically mental illness or not. The American Psychiatric Association is the one that says that gender dysphoria is not a mental illness. So clinically, medically, that's correct. Gender dysphoria is not a mental illness. So now the question, is the same true for anorexia and another form of body dysphoria? Well, again, I would just go to what the people with the training and the experience say about this, and if they say it is, okay, then it is. Now, I mentioned that. Now let's go to call it the sphere where I would operate. I think it's really important that we understand whether the American Psychiatric Association or anybody else says something is a mental illness or uses the term disorder. I think that all of humanity, myself included, all of us are disordered. It may not be what the APA says it is a disorder, but I think all of us are disordered because all of us have the mark, the taint of sin that has disordered us. It has disordered our thoughts. It has disordered our spirits. It has disordered even our bodies. So all of us have this. And what is the result of sin? The sting of sin is death. All of us are disordered. And whether that disorder would manifest, that disorder can manifest itself in all kinds of different things. But I think all of us are disordered. And I know that's not a very popular thing to say. So, I mean, I would, Romans chapter 7, Paul does a really good job of kind of generalizing this. In Romans chapter 7, Paul says this, and this sounds disordered to me. Starting at verse 21. So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being, I delight in God's law. But I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind, making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. What a wretched man I am. See, it sounds dysphoric. It sounds disordered. Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? Verse 25. Thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself, in my mind, am a slave to God's law, but in my sinful nature, a slave to the law of sin. And you should keep reading, going to chapter 8. But I think what's so significant about this, we can talk about what man labels as a disorder and what mankind does not label as a disorder. As far as a mental illness, I'm not qualified to say that is or is not a mental illness, but I do believe that gender dysphoria, anorexia, body dysphoria, screen addiction, gluttony, alcohol addiction, drug addiction, lust, pornography addiction, pride, greed, the pursuit of wealth, coveting what other people have for yourself, envy. You see where I'm going with this? The list just goes on. I think all of those are spiritual illness, are spiritual disorders. They are the law of sin at work in us. And the only path to deliverance from all of the spiritual disorder that all of us have, and I think it just manifests itself in different ways, the only path forward is to be delivered through Jesus Christ our Lord. That's it. And this is my one of the issues I take especially when we're talking about transgenderism, is by and large I've heard a lot of us versus them, and we just have to be careful with that, because people who are transgender are people just like me and just like you and just like everybody else. They're people, and they bear within them the inherent dignity that should be called upon by bearing the image of God. They have a different manifestation, a different expression of what's going on inside of them, just like different from me and different from everybody else. But all of us have there's something that's misaligned in us, there's something disordered in us, and that's because of sin. And all of us need to recognize that in others, so we can treat each other as people like us, and with compassion and with empathy. And so, again, you said that gender dysphoria is not a mental illness. Well, that's what the doctors say, and I'm not a doctor, but I do think all of us have a spiritual disorder that can only be remedied. The only solution is in the loving arms of Jesus Christ, which all people, I believe, have a place in. Okay, I hope that takes care of these 4 questions for today. Then, when I look through the gender questions, we're almost done. I have like maybe 1 or 2 more videos. But thanks for your patience in listening, and I hope to see you guys at church. I won't be there this weekend. Pastor Mike's going to be preaching. He's going to do an awesome job. But I'll be back the following week, because I'm going up to PA this weekend to officiate a wedding. So hope you guys have a great week and rest of your week, and a great weekend. Love you. Bye.